Black the Name by D.B. Halpert. Narrated by the author, D.B. Halpert.
Chapter 1. Forced. With the loud crash of her room's door slamming open, Elizabeth's head leaps from her pillow, waking in a panic. Painful screams bellow through the doorway from the glowing courtyard beyond a black shadow of a heavily breathing figure within the ajar door's frame. An alien smell of sulphurous smoke cascades into the room past the robed figure of Father Bartholomew. With heavy breaths from running through the smoke, the priest calls into the room, "Elizabeth, child, come quickly." Throwing her sheets off, Elizabeth runs to the priest's side, her thin, frail frame only recently having grown to bring her head to the lower half of Father Bartholomew's chest, forces her worried expression to look up to him with her concerns. Her sky-blue hair, long and messily braided, falls onto the Rush teen's mid-back as, coming to a sudden stop before the priest, she gazes up to his eyes, sheepishly asking, "Father, what's happening?" "No time to explain, child. But I believe your parents may know you are here. We must hurry. This way," the old priest exclaims, and his form, gowned in white vestments, turns, leaving his back and head of pepper-gray hair for Elizabeth to follow. Without a second thought, Elizabeth gives chase, running into step behind Father Bartholomew, her bare feet patting softly on the polished stone floor. Outside of her room, Elizabeth looks in terror at a blazing, hellish red-orange fire that has consumed most of the temple's complex. Not slowing to absorb the calamity, Elizabeth desperately keeps pace with the near jog of Bartholomew. The teen jumps to the priest's side suddenly as she notices a group of hooded shadows emerge from a room across the courtyard. Their silhouettes move in the distance, shifting and flickering menacingly as the fire grows and dances around them, before their movements take them into another room next to the one which they left. Seemingly not noticing Father Bartholomew's haste deeper into the building. A moment that feels far longer than it is brings the priest and young girl to a plain, disinteresting door. The doorway is an old, warped passage which requires more than an insignificant pole to open, through which Bartholomew ushers Elizabeth into a small room beyond, filled with supplies necessary for the cleaning and basic repair of the temple's grounds. Inside the small room rests mops, buckets, and brooms leaning against the walls. Entering the room, Bartholomew beckons Elizabeth to follow, speaking in a hushed tone. "Wait in the cellar, and do not open the door for anyone except for me. Everything will be all right." With a confirming nod, Elizabeth steps to the simple rug laid across the stone floor, and lifting it, she reveals a small wooden trap door that she opens and enters through. Bartholomew closes the small wooden square behind Elizabeth as she steps to the subterranean floor beneath the closet. The cold, wet cellar sits with the stale scent of mold from disuse and dried meats which have gone bad, with a set of sleeping materials covered with holes from disrepair sprawled in one corner. The sound of screaming and the roar of the fire above are dampened as the hatch is closed and the rug is slid back over it. Elizabeth sits on the cold, seemingly damp floor, wrapping her arms around her knees as the quiet becomes suffocating with tension. A cool breeze swirls around the frightful, shaking girl, and the moisture of the shadows begin to shift on their own, dancing and shaping into a swirl that amasses in the air before Elizabeth, who watches, and the fear in her eyes turns to joy. After a short instance, the motion stops. The shadows break, returning to the corners and the cracks they drew from in the pitch blackness of the room. The moisture that joined with the shadows drops into a small puddle on the stone floor, slinking off a floating mass of pinkish-purplish flesh about the size of Elizabeth's head that floats in the room's center. 4 fleshy arm-length tentacles unravel, extending from the sphere as it slowly begins to rotate counterclockwise. A sharp, jagged, yellow, toothy grin beams from the side of the orb, which turns to face Elizabeth beneath a vertical slit of a single eye's lids opening with a heavy sideways blink, revealing the alien creature's bizarre but benign sideways cat-like eye. Forgetting the horrors happening outside, if only for a moment, Elizabeth jumps to her feet and, running to the floating orb of flesh, wraps it quickly with her arms, exclaiming in a whisper, "Boop! Why are you here?" "Well, that doesn't matter now. Come, we have to stay quiet. We might be in trouble." Like a dog seeing its master for the first time in months, the orb called Boop begins happily licking Elizabeth's face as she pulls him down into the corner from which she stood, desperately failing her every attempt to prevent large wipes of slobber from coating her cheek. Above the cellar, Bartholomew pulls the rug back over the wooden trap door. With a deep breath, he grabs a bucket from a shelf, throwing himself from the room. Running to the small pond in the courtyard, the middle-aged priest dips the bucket and runs to the blaze, releasing the contents feebly at the fire. Turning to return to the pond, Bartholomew's wrists are grabbed hard by figures in dark hooded robes and yanked from his feet. Bartholomew's bucket drops on the hard, ash-covered stone floor as he is dragged into the courtyard and forced to his knees. Looking to his assailants, the priest demands answers. "Who are you? Why are you burning the Church of Archangel? What do you want from us?" The two figures holding down the priest remain silent, their grips tightening as he demands information. Another shadow makes several steps forward, bringing himself before the straining old man in the flickering light of the fire, and leaning down to Bartholomew, presses himself face to face with the old priest. Leathery, tan skin stretches taut across the stranger's face, with wiry black hairs piercing forward in a pointed beard that frames the bottom of the gaunt face, while unsettling deep, sunken, almost glowing yellow eyes command attention, with black root-like veins seemingly having grown from the sockets visible through the skin. The man's eyes flash for a moment, as a deep, growling, malevolent voice digs itself into Bartholomew's mind. "I recognize you. You have seen my daughter, cared for her. Thank you. Now, tell me, where is she, old man?" Bartholomew pulls back, straining, fighting the voice in her head as he yells out in defiance. "She is long gone. She told me what you were when she got here, and your lord will never use her. You monster! Archangel will smite your soul before you have a chance for an afterlife." The voice echoes again in the priest's head as a grin creeps across the stranger's face. "Ignorant priest, I needn't fear an afterlife if I grow immortal. And worry not, you need to tell me where my daughter is. I will simply take from you the knowledge I seek." The figure reaches his insidious fingers forward, grasping the priest's temples, his black nails digging into the flesh with ease, drawing small trickles of blood from the skin. Bartholomew's eyes roll back into his skull as he begins to scream in pain. The dark stranger's face gasps for air as, almost in ecstasy, he absorbs the thoughts and memories of the screaming priest. Thunder crashes above the burning temple, and rain begins to fall in a downpour. With a flash of blue lightning, the old priest Bartholomew falls to the ground, and the creeping stranger stumbles back, chuckling. "You were strong of will, but still so weak." And pointing to the hooded figures that hold the priest, the stranger commands, "You, keep him close. I want to use him again soon." Lifting the unconscious man, the two hooded figures drag Bartholomew out of the courtyard, seemingly through the flames, out of the temple. The man, claiming himself to be Elizabeth's father, steps away, turning from the underlings carrying out his bidding, and slowly begins stepping through the courtyard in the direction of the closet Elizabeth is hidden beneath. An explosion of thunder muffles the crash of the door as it slams open. The black, menacing silhouette stands outlined in the lightning's flash, glaring in with a wicked and unearthly grin. Two more hooded figures in similar black robes slink in past their master, drawing back the rug, revealing the small trapdoor. An explosion of thunder echoes again, louder than the ones that heralded the beginning of the storm, startling Elizabeth and her companion, who turns in the girl's arms, growling softly at the door. Shifting sounds of motion sift through the wooden door, causing Elizabeth's grip to tighten instinctively around the orb of flesh named Boop, when suddenly the door cracks against its horizontal frame. Once, twice, 3 times, the wood begins to creak against itself with each slam before breaking in a shower of splinters. One of the hooded figures pulls hard against the wood cellar door, breaking it free from the frame, leaving the other glaring into the cramped stone room at a cowering girl holding a strange, growling orb with outstretched tentacle eye stalks. Turning back to his leader, the hooded figure gestures inquisitively toward the frightened child, before looking once more into the cellar. With his vision shifting back to the cellar, the man is struck with sudden fear as energy begins to amass near the ends of 2 of the creature's eye stalks, which have locked themselves in his direction. After less than a second, the gathering energy releases in powerful rays, one like a ribbon of cold that freezes the moisture in the air between the eye and the hooded figure, solidifying the wet black cloak, and a second that pulses through the air like shock waves of the sound barrier being broken several times in a row, but silent, impacting and throwing the stiffening figure back through the door past the malevolent stranger, who steps to the side out of the way. In a single insidious snake-like motion, the stranger, claiming himself Elizabeth's father, sways from the door of the closet to the opening into the cellar. Hands outstretched, 2 black arcane sigils form and begin to spin 2 inches from his palms, as discs parallel to his hands. 2 eye stalks waving around in a seemingly random fashion lock onto the stranger, but no energy seems to gather, and the orb of flesh barks angrily as black tendrils, speckled with diamonds of purple glitter, whip out from the glowing sigils, grabbing the flailing eye stalks. Barking turns into squeals of pain when the tendrils begin to pull at the tentacle eye stalks, ripping the creature from Elizabeth's arm and releasing the sickening sound of tearing flesh. The stranger begins to laugh as his power begins ripping the alien orb apart. "Little pet, you have meddled for too long. It is time for you to die." "Boop! Stop, you monster! Please, Boop, be safe! Go, now!" Elizabeth screams, seeing her friend torn apart in front of her. In response to Elizabeth's cry, Boop's form breaks apart, becoming intangible, vanishing like shadows that shoot back to be absorbed into Elizabeth's head. The instant the dark vapor vanishes within Elizabeth's temples, another dark-robed hooded figure grabs her from behind. Desperately, Elizabeth struggles to break free, kicking into the hooded man's shin. The grip on Elizabeth's arm releases while her assailant reels in pain, allowing her to begin running for the way out of the cellar, charging the grinning master. With his hands still outstretched from the magic he used to begin tearing the creature known as Boop apart, the dark stranger utters a phrase in a black alien language that echoes unnaturally around him. A black collar forms around Elizabeth's throat with the word of power, and her muscles seize up, causing her to lose all ability to move, falling to the ground. With another insidious grin, the stranger points, commanding the figure in the cellar. "If you are finished, slime, pick up my daughter and bring her out. Her mother is waiting." Obeying the orders, the hooded figure hefts the small girl over his shoulder and carries her up out of the cellar. Smoke intoxicatingly billows through the structure that is quickly becoming a ruin through the hunger of the flames. The black clouds reek, filled with the smell of burning hair and flesh that to most would be suffocating. Pain is all Elizabeth can feel as her head swings upside down over the hooded man's shoulder, causing her to remain gasping for air, ever unsatisfied with each breath. Outside of the front entrance of the temple, Elizabeth is placed onto the ground, the rain piercing through the clouds of smoke onto her face. Her hands clasp into fists as feeling returns to them, and she painfully begins to force herself from her back. The small girl sits up, and looking around, she accepts the futility of an attempt to run, before locking her eyes with an angry and terrified glare onto two particular figures. Two figures that Elizabeth hasn't seen in 6 years. Her birth parents stand before her within the semicircular wall of hooded monsters that would call themselves followers of those two people, if you could call them that. The one that would call herself Elizabeth's mother is the first of the two to speak, calling out to the child she bore. "Oh, Elizabeth, my daughter! You had your father and I worried. Is this pathetic place where you really have been hiding? This is not a place suited for someone of your disposition, dear." "Bring out the one that would call himself the girl's father speaks, with a sound of disgust splitting his sentence with intent. "Father." Upon receiving the command, two more of the cultic figures emerge from the temple, carrying the weak body of Priest Bartholomew. Elizabeth turns to see what her birth father was commanding for, to see the weak state of the man she had come to love as though he were her father. Unable to keep silent, Elizabeth calls out to Bartholomew, "Father!" before turning back to the couple, directing the horrors that surround her. "Don't you dare hurt him! You ungrateful child! You would seek to replace your father with this man of blasphemous belief?" The woman yells angrily in response, before finding her husband's hand upon her shoulder. "I wouldn't dream of hurting him any further, child. That is for you to do." The man's voice becomes almost a growl as his head bends to the side and he takes a step toward the child with an unsettling grin. Elizabeth takes a step away from the encroaching figure, falling back in exasperation at the absurdity of the comment. Quickly, the girl's form rises to her feet. Defiantly, she exclaims to the one that would call himself her father, "You can't be serious! I won't! He is more of a father to me than you ever were." "That is exactly why you will. You see, your father is a jealous man, and you must prove that you still love him more than this man who kidnapped you from us." The man responds to the girl's statement, placing a hand to his heart. "Yes, show your father your love, daughter," the woman chimes almost gleefully from behind the man. "I won't!" Elizabeth cries out, her eyes on the verge of tears as she remains defiant. "You will," Elizabeth's birth father exclaims, extending his hands toward the defiant child. White outlined black arcane disc-like sigils again form before the man's hands. For the small girl Elizabeth, the environment around her becomes still and silent, though the rain continues to strike her, forming droplets which fall from her flesh and sleeping dress. Everything around Elizabeth becomes black, and everyone around her becomes frozen in place. Even the fire fails to dance against the falling rain or produce light. Above the temple, Elizabeth sees, peering through the clouds of smoke and the storm, the white sphere of the moon, which disappears as though behind eyelids of an eye like boops, rotated to be vertical. Reopening, the moon no longer holds its place, instead being replaced by a monstrous eye that is deep crimson red, before color is stripped away from everything, leaving only shades of gray, and leaving Elizabeth unable to move or breathe, only able to think. The voice of the man who would call himself Elizabeth's father, and another of malevolent alien origin echoes, as though through an empty expanse of a massive temple's chapel. Within Elizabeth's mind, "Now, child, obey and turn to the priest." Elizabeth's mind mutters softly, still defiant, "No." Insolence! The voices yell, digging into Elizabeth's mind. The celestial eye, glaring down, sends a spear-like beam of energy that pierces the small girl's head, jolting directly down her spine. In painful, stiff motions, Elizabeth's body begins to turn slowly from the man and woman who claim to be her parents, instead to face Father Bartholomew. Fists clenched, Elizabeth struggles, fighting against the force that drives her motion, only making the movement slower and more painful. When Elizabeth's body has fully turned to that of the priest who kneels subdued outside the still burning temple, shadows form, figures without mass, inching toward the girl, presenting a gruesome curved, serrated knife, laying upon an ornate blood-red pillow trimmed with black threads. Hand trembling, the girl's body reaches for the blade's grip, her eyes welling up, bloodshot with tears. The slimy black leather finds itself in Elizabeth's hand, and she cries out in her head, unable to move her lips to produce any sound. "Stop! Please!" With the knife in Elizabeth's grasp, the shadows retract into the ring of hooded figures. Elizabeth strains, calling out in her head in pain, pleading again, "I don't want to do this!" as her body takes a step toward the hunched-over priest. Pat! Another resisted step falls, grinding the dirt underfoot, bringing Elizabeth's body toward the man held to the ground by cultic goons. Grabbing the priest Bartholomew's hair, one of the hooded figures lifts back, revealing the man's weeping face and jugular. Before Elizabeth's hands come together, shaking in pain, trembling as her mind tries desperately to refuse the action the body is performing. But a twisted grin forces itself across the child's face as tears stream from her eyes. In a flash, her frail, shaking form stands, grinning over Bartholomew, her eyes holding every ounce of sadness she has, while her mind cries out again and again for release, for the ability to stop her movements. The center of the semicircle of hooded figures implodes with immense dark energy, an orb of pure black which spirals furiously where Elizabeth's body stands, hands coated in blood with the serrated alien blade buried through the throat of the man she loved as a father. In that moment, the control held over her breaks, and the young Elizabeth cries out in heartbreak and fury, "No! Why?" Falling to her knees in exhaustion. Astounded by the energy surrounding them, the hooded men who held Bartholomew in place step away, letting the body fall to the ground. They begin to be torn apart when they reach the sphere's edge, the swirling vortex of energy disintegrating them as sheets of fabric being unspun. Their screams of pain falling only fully upon deaf ears of Elizabeth, and in a muffled form barely reach those watching the eldritch fear dancing before them. With the last threat of the men dematerializing, the sphere, in a sudden surge of even greater intensity, collapses down on itself, everything within disappearing in an explosive pop, which sends out a shockwave, knocking all but those who would call Elizabeth their daughter from their feet, sending the woman into a frenzy, yelling out manically, "Where is she? Where is our perfect lord's vassal?"